All right, this is the day 3 recap of Offer Mastery Live 2024. If you haven't seen the first video or the second video from Tuesday and Wednesday, I'll link those in the description. Today's speakers were Daniel Priestley, Dr. Benjamin Hardy, Nika Maples, Allison Ednoff, Dr. Sonia Stribling, and Myron Golden. So we'll talk about basically what each one of them had to say. It started out today with Myron, who talked about wealth building. One of the things he talked about was that one should make sure that the way you make money, the way you build wealth matches the economic era you're living in. So he started by showing that the economic era has been dominant throughout human history. So if you had land, that's what made you successful. If you were born with land, you would die with that land, and those were the wealthy people. But since the economic era dominated by agriculture ended around the 1750s or so, since there have been increasingly shorter economic eras that have followed. So the industrial era, then the distribution era, then technology, information, what he calls the techno-info edutainment era, which was just a few years ago, then the partnership era, and now he views this as currently the age of AI, that era. So my background is in robotics and artificial intelligence. So I was talking to a friend I met on Tuesday of this week, who is in education. And while we were in the initial keynote with Myron, he was talking about the age of AI. My friend, we're going to call him Moses in this video. I didn't get his permission to say this or show this text, but I get a text while I was in the middle of the session. I didn't read it at the time, thinking it was someone else that I knew, but it was this text. We had exchanged emails earlier in the morning, and he texted me. He was there at the keynote, and then he had to leave to go to his daughter's graduation. But he said, "This is your age and time." And we had been talking about the artificial intelligence that I was involved in, my robotics work, and he was saying that there's really a big need for that in the educational space. And then we go to the keynote, and the speaker essentially said that this is the age of AI, which is my area. And so I'll certainly be putting a lot more YouTube videos up related to robotics and AI, so stay tuned for that. The next speaker was Daniel Priestley, and he has coined this term oversubscribed. And the idea there is that you create a great deal of demand for your product or service and make sure that your demand outweighs your supply. So if you have a certain capacity, you want to make sure your capacity is far below what the demand is. And he had 5 principles related to this idea of oversubscribed. If you have not read the book Oversubscribed, I haven't read it yet either, but I'm planning to read it soon. I'll link it in the description, and you can find it on Amazon pretty easily through that link. And it'll help the channel as well if you want to do that. The first principle was that only oversubscribed businesses make profit. So again, this tension between supply and demand. If the demand is high, the supply is low, those are the businesses that would be able to raise prices and be profitable. The second principle is that the only people that matter are your people. So you want to, as an oversubscribed business, focus on your people and not those people who don't care about your product or service. The third thing is that you want to first make the market and then make your sales. So you want to generate demand for your product or service before you start trying to make sales at all. The fourth thing is that people buy to resolve tension. And so there is some type of tension that they have psychologically, and buying your product or service relieves that tension. Finally, people buy when the conditions are right. If there are any kind of obstacles or constraints on buying, that will keep people from doing that. But if the constraints are taken away, the obstacles are removed, then that's when people buy. And so he had a lot to say about oversubscribed businesses and how we should be seeking to be in that position where demand is high, supply is low. The next speaker was Nika Maples, and she, at the age of 20, had a massive stroke and became a quadriplegic. And her doctor gave her basically no chance of survival, and she actually used a cane and was helped to the stage, and she spoke at a podium, and she had a very powerful story. And one of the things she said about her mother's faith, when her mother was there in the hospital, she had had the stroke. Nika had had the stroke. She was lying in the bed. She couldn't move anything, but she could hear. And so she heard the interaction between her doctor and her mother. And her mother asked the doctor multiple times, has anyone who's had this condition ever survived? And the doctor kept trying to evade the question, and he didn't really want her mother to have faith that she would be able to survive. And her mother finally pressed him on it. He said, well, maybe one person. And her mother said, one's all I need. And so what Nika said about her mother is that I only saw what I saw, but she, speaking of her mother, could see what she didn't see. So this idea of her mother having faith was something that helped her pull through. So she said, for your own story, whatever that might be, there are going to be four types of people. The first type of person is the naysayer, like the doctor, who didn't believe that she was going to survive and gave her no chance to live. The second type of person is an okay sayer, which is like Nika. Actually, at the time, she was listening, unable to move, and she was irritated with her mother for even pressing this. She just thought she was going to die based on what she had heard from the doctors and nurses and wanted to just be left alone. But the third type of person is a yay sayer, is what she calls it. And that's a person that's like Nika's mother, who was cheering her on and who believed and had faith that she would pull through. And then their fourth type of person is a waysayer, someone who can show or coach you through the way. And this was Nika's physical therapist. Her physical therapist, when she began to come in to work with her, of course, she's a quadriplegic at the time. The physical therapist didn't treat her as if she wasn't going to survive. The physical therapist pushed her and prodded her. And of course, she was at the stage. Quick story here. I saw Nika earlier in the week. She was sitting out in the crowd like the rest of us, and she had this cane, and you could see her really struggling to move around. And I was feeling sorry for her. I didn't know she was actually going to be one of the speakers. And then it ends up that she's this life coach and really successful entrepreneur, doing a whole lot better financially than most of the people in the room. And so there was no reason to feel sorry for her. She actually survived being a quadriplegic, having a stroke at the age of 20. She's in a really good place. And so it was interesting to see this woman that I had seen earlier in the week get up on the stage and speak to us. So next, Myron Golden talked about the idea of covenant. Sometimes people get this mixed up, the difference between a covenant and a contract. A contract is an agreement between individuals based upon a mutual distrust. So the reason why you have a contract between two people is because you don't trust each other. Because if you did, you wouldn't need a contract. But the contract is in place so that you don't do something to me that I don't like, or I don't do something to you that you won't like. That's why people come up with contracts. And so one of the points he made is that's why we shouldn't refer to marriage as a contract. It's actually a covenant. And a covenant is an agreement between individuals based upon love and trust. So a covenant is where two people make an agreement where they actually do trust each other, whereas a contract is in place between two people who don't trust each other. So after this, we went to lunch, and lunch has been great the last couple of days. Got to meet different entrepreneurs and people who are farther ahead than I am. And so today I was sitting at a table with an entrepreneur who has scaled businesses from 6 and 7 figures up to 8 figures. And he's currently a stay-at-home dad, and he's supporting his wife, who was formerly making roughly $60,000 as an attorney, and now she's making nearly 10 times that, according to him. He said that so far this year, her revenue is somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000, and that there's another $230,000 that's coming. And she doesn't know much about this. He's really the person that's really making collections and getting the money from people, but she's the one that's doing the work, where she's helping people with issues of being laid off unfairly. And so her attorney work is based on that. So it was a really interesting conversation. He said his next goal is to scale a business from zero up to 8 figures and maybe 9 figures and beyond. So he's really trying to get his wife to be self-sufficient where he doesn't have to help her with the entrepreneurship part anymore. And then he can move on to something new. He also talked a little bit about his kids and how his daughter has some of that entrepreneurial spirit in her, that his son still needs a little bit more work, but that it's important to teach kids this. So after lunch, we got back in there, and Myron Golden had some things to say about Price's law. And so this is similar to the Pareto principle, where often we see in nature, in business, that 20% of your inputs result in 80% of your outputs. Now, Price's law is a similar one, where it says that 50% of production is made by the square root of the domain. So imagine you have a team of 4 people. According to Price's law, roughly half of that production is going to come from the square root of the 4 people, which is 2. Now, that makes a lot of sense, but when you scale it up, you begin to see something that he told us, which was that mediocrity scales exponentially, but excellence only scales incrementally. So if you think about a 25-person team, half of the results or production is going to generally be made by 5 out of those 25 people. If you have a 100-person team, then half of your production is made by roughly 10 of those people. And so you can see that as teams get larger and larger, more and more of the work is done by a fewer number of people. And so, again, his idea there was that mediocrity scales exponentially, but excellence only scales incrementally. So my takeaway from that is that you probably want to keep teams smaller rather than making them much larger, which again it ties into Pareto's principle as well. Next was Dr. Sonia Stribling, and she had a lot to say about change. She had a lot of problems in her former life. She said she became a mother for the first time at the age of 15. She was raped at age 17, and she was a long-time Army veteran, major in the Army. And then later on in life, her husband left her and divorced her. And she had all of these things that all of these former personalities that were holding her back from becoming the entrepreneur and mother and person that she wanted to be. So she had this quote, "What needs to die in order for you to live?" So this motivational piece to talking to us about how we may need to distance ourselves from former ways of thinking in order to do things in the future. Then she talked a little bit about what she calls the power pyramid, a way to pretty easily, according to her, scale up to $6.2 million. And starts with being a speaker. She says, well, you can probably go and find 2 speaking gigs per month that are $3,000 or more a piece. Then you can become an author. If you learn how to sell $25 books and sell 1,000 of them in a year, then you could scale. You could have $25,000 in a year from your books. Next, she talked about events. That if you have a $200 ticket to an event that you have and you sell that to 1,000 people, that's $200,000. But most of that 6.2 million that she's talking about in a year really comes from the final 2 pieces. The fourth part is selling a $1,000 course to 1,000 people, which would be roughly $1 million. And then the 5th level would be coaching or a mastermind of some kind, where you would sell a $5,000 coaching or mastermind program to 1,000 people. All of those things put together would be 6.2 million. It's always interesting to hear these entrepreneurs who have done this speak about it so matter of fact that it's just math. And of course it is, but it can be difficult to change your mindset to see that. Next was Allison Edenoff. She talked a lot about government contracts and how she's used that to scale up her business to over $21 million in revenue last year, I believe it was $21 million in revenue. She said that if you don't have the pressure, you won't find another way to break through. And so there were pressures on her early on, and her being laid off was something that was helpful to her, and her quitting a job was something that put pressure on her and allowed her to be able to find other ways to bring in income, specifically being an entrepreneur and leveraging government contracts to build her business. So she talked about winning big bids from the government, and she talked a lot about minority, I forget the term, but it had to do with, I'm actually going to look it up in my notebook real quick, but it was minority business enterprise, local business enterprise. I think there's female or women's business enterprise. There are these different business enterprises where the government wants to incentivize people that are minorities in those different ways, or people that are local to the area, to become entrepreneurs and do government work. And so there are millions and if not billions of dollars, if you combine all of the different county, city, state, and federal agencies, there are billions of dollars that go to small businesses who do work for the government. So this is a great opportunity in many different areas. My areas in engineering, robotics, and AI. So that will be an opportunity for me, of course. Next, Dr. Benjamin Hardy, who also spoke yesterday, came back. He lives in the Orlando area, so he drove home, came back to be with us again today. He is the author of 10X is Easier Than 2X and several other books, and I'll link a couple of those in the description. He actually gave us a copy of his 10X is Easier Than 2X book, the hard copy. So we got that today. I don't have it with me right now, but that was kind of him to do that. Apparently, Daniel Priestley earlier in the week had a book that he gave away about scorecard marketing, and I may link that in the description as well. I didn't get into Tampa until 9 a.m., which was exactly when the conference was starting. So I think that's when they were handing out those books. So I missed that this week. But back to Dr. Hardy, he said that the ultimate strategy is no. That's the core strategy. And so he talked a lot about raising your floor, raising the standard of what you will say yes to. So anything below that standard, you should say no to. And that can be a difficult thing to do when you're used to doing things that perhaps are not that valuable to you. But the core strategy is saying no more often. He talked about Warren Buffett and how much of Warren Buffett's success is because of how many investments he says no to. And same thing with Charlie Munger, the late business partner of Warren Buffett. So after Dr. Hardy's keynote, Myron Golden came back out. They both were on stage together and were answering questions from people. And a lot of times there were questions from people about comfort. And one of the things that Myron said today was that comfort is not required, but transformation is required. And so there was an interesting moment earlier in the week where there was a man who said, how can you show us how to put training wheels on this so that when we go out and try to do this entrepreneurship thing, we don't fall and hurt ourselves? And one of the things that was said is that that's part of the learning process. You actually need to fall and hurt yourself. So I think anybody that's ridden a bike before probably knows that training wheels are probably not the fastest way to learn. You probably want to start learning without training wheels as soon as possible, and that will accelerate your growth and your ability to learn how to ride a bike. And entrepreneurship is similar, I'm finding out. Okay, so towards the end, David Shands, if you're familiar with Sleep is for Suckers, or he has a popular podcast, I think the most popular business podcast in the world. And he was there. He's a student of Myron Golden's, and he got on stage and basically did a conversation with him at the very end of our time today. And so he mentioned the fact that Myron has these sayings and these what he calls bars, of course. And he said, well, I don't really have things like that. I don't have bars like you do. And so how do you do that? And so one of the things that Myron said is that when you have a good point to make, one of the things you want to do is really work on the packaging of the point. Focus on making things clearer so that it becomes easier for other people to digest. And one of the ways he does this is something he calls ATF, alliterated tripolar formula. I think the word is tripolar. It could be uh, a different word, but I couldn't quite make out what he meant. But I knew that the tri meant three. But the idea is that the alliterated part means that each point that you're going to make, let's say you make 3 to 5 points or more, but each point should begin with the same letter or prefix, or it should end with the same suffix for each point, so that there is either a rhyming of it, or there is a alliteration that is easier to recall. The second thing is that it needs to be tripolar, meaning you need to make at least two, or you need to make at least 3 points if you're going to do this type of thing. And I'm going to give you an example that he has repeated throughout his videos, and he also said it at the conference as well. And then the formula means you say it that way each time. So if you're going to explain this particular idea, you're going to explain it this way each time, with alliteration, with those 3 to 5 points or more, if that's what you want to do. So one of the ATFs that he often uses is on value, and he calls it the 4 levels of value. And what he says is that the lowest level of value is implementation. So if you think about a factory worker or a mechanic, you can get to a certain amount of income doing that, but that's the lowest level, where you use your hands and your time to create value. The second level of value is called unification. This is where you have managers who are able to take other people who are doing work and mobilize them. And so you can make a lot more money than just a low-level worker if you're a manager, but there's a certain cutoff. There's a certain place, and you're going to come up to a ceiling. So the other 2 levels of value are the highest levels of value, and they're the ones that most people should focus on if they're wanting to level up how much value they create. So the next one is communication. And so this can be anything from being a speaker to being someone who's a songwriter. And it's almost an infinite amount of value that you can provide to the world. You think about somebody like Taylor Swift that communicates, but the thing that she also does is the 4th level of value, which is imagination. And so someone who combines communication with imagination, this is certainly something we do in entrepreneurship. That is that's what we should all be striving for. So here he's used an ATF to talk about these different levels of value, from implementation to unification to communication to imagination. So this is where he used the suffix version. There are others where he might start the word with the same letter or with the same phrase even. And so we had this earlier in the week. If you look at the day 2 video, I believe I have an example of that, where he talks about that past perceived voids lead to present pursued values. And so he talked about that. And so you had past perceived voids, you had present perceived values, or something like that. I don't remember it. You have to go back to day 1 or day 2. I think it was day 2 to look at that one. I'm going to go ahead and finish up the video. It's almost been 25 minutes. It's gone by pretty fast. But I will say that this is supposed to be the last Offer Mastery Live ever. One of the things he talked about in his conversation with David Shands was that it seemed that there could be other ways to influence more people, create the transformation he's looking to create, without all of the headache of putting on a live event like this. It's a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort, a lot of conversations that go into putting on an event like this. And Myron essentially said, I don't want to do that anymore. And so he's said repeatedly that this is going to be the last one. But there seemed to be a little room for doubt there. And so, not sure. But if that is the last one, we would be looking forward to seeing what the next iteration of event is that he might want to do, where he's able to help people transform and really level up the way they are as entrepreneurs. So like I said, we're coming up on 25 minutes. I'm actually back in Nashville now, not at the Airbnb in Tampa. So I just got in a couple of hours ago, and looking forward to really putting out more content related to robotics and AI. So stay tuned for that. But until next time, thanks for watching.